I had to decide first whether I wanted to do it in 1 volume or 2. I had already thought that the first thing I must do is to tell the story of the years when I was in number 10 Downing Street. They were exciting years. They were purposeful years. We changed the entire economy. We had the Falklands water fight. We had the Libyan raid. We had the end of the Cold War. We had the Gulf. And then I sat down and wrote as much as I could remember about each, without in fact referring to documents, making a note of what I needed to look up. I was very lucky with some things because after the end of the Falklands, it had been such a deep, agonizing experience that the following Christmas I sat down and wrote it up while all the memories were very fresh in my mind. And so that is perhaps particularly vivid. And as I went, I wrote up some other special occasions, if we had a particularly difficult one in negotiating finance with Europe. If I had a particularly difficult problem when someone resigned, all of these were written up. But apart from that, I was on official records, the sort of thing that a biographer would have. But I knew as I went through them, I looked at all of these rather clinically, beautifully phrased and drafted minutes and cabinet minutes and conclusions, that no biographer could have got really any flavour from that, of the sense of battle we had in some of the meetings, the sense of debate, the sense of argument. And so I became an absolute convert to the person themselves who'd gone through all the experiences writing the book. It's now in the 1 volume, so it can be read without too much difficulty. It'd be a little bit much to read in bed, a little bit heavy perhaps, but otherwise it can be read as 1 volume. You can, provided that about 1 day a week you do have a night when you can just have longer if you wish. But you know, it becomes so much a habit that you find you can't sleep very much longer. I did it because it had to be done. Or whatever has to be done, you somehow find the energy to do. To address Congress was the biggest thing that had happened to me. And I knew that Ronald Reagan, when he did it, was absolutely superb, a real professional. He used the autocue teleprompter. And it's so much better to use it, otherwise you're looking down at your notes. And if you've got teleprompter, then you're looking up, and you may go from one teleprompter to another, but your eyes never leave the audience. I wasn't as skilled at it as he was, so I had to practice. And in fact, we borrowed his autocue. But I arrived from the VC-10 quite late at the embassy, and they had set up the autocue. And you know, when you actually read through a speech for speaking, as distinct from for drafting, you frequently find you have to change it. For drafting, for reading, you've got the sentences too long. For speaking, they must be shorter. And you actually change the final version quite a bit while you're actually doing the rehearsal with autocue. And it was very, very late, and I got 1 or 2 very complicated sentences which had to be just honed down. And we did it. I think I only had about an hour and a half sleep, because it was more important to have my hair done than to have an extra hour's sleep. And then we went, and it went quite well, so I was quite pleased. Scripted? No, it couldn't possibly be. Because you didn't know what the questions were going to be. The original question to the Prime Minister would run something like this: will the Prime Minister give the House details of her official engagements today, one after the other? That developed the question to ask of the Prime Minister. And then it couldn't give you any clue to the supplementary question, which was the real sting. Will you find time today to look at my hospital, to see about this particular complaint, to deal with some particular international incident? And you know, for every question time, which only lasted under 20 minutes, I would take about 4 hours preparation, trying to spot what the questions would be, because they like to catch me out with the latest topical question. And then immediately you had to think of a response. Question, immediate response. So it really is what we would call being quick on your feet and having a quick response time. He did say, look, try to put personal recollections, because that makes it human. And anyway, you don't need urging to do that, because so many of the things occur because you either get on very well with someone, or you've had a breakthrough in negotiations, or you've had a difficulty or a problem. This is the very stuff of politics, it's the very stuff of negotiations. All of that is true. Because, yes, it is lonely. And there are times when you're down in the dumps, times when things don't go right, particularly in politics. And you've just got to have your husband there whose loyalty and affection are just unquestioned, and who also can give you advice. Don't get things out of proportion, which is very, very important, because sometimes a small thing can get completely out of proportion. And so at the end of the day, I might have returned from the House of Commons at about 11 o'clock, and he perhaps would be up in the flat. There's a small flat at the top of number 10, not a grand flat at all, nothing like the White House. Small in the rafters. We had no housekeeper, no cook. I just had a daily help in the mornings. So the evening I just used to go and get supper ready, if we neither of us had it, a very light supper. He was in industry himself, very well known. He was in the oil and chemical industry, in contact with all industries. Frequently his services called upon to either give advice to others or to speak at the industrial dinners. And he always kept off politics and spoke about what he knew about. He never had an interview. He wouldn't. He never had a political secretary. He wrote himself about between 30 and 50 replies every week to letters he'd had from the public. And after the Dear Bill letters, which appeared in Private Eye, from Dennis to Bill, although Dennis hadn't written them, it was just, that's the way the newspaper played it. He seemed to be the nation's favorite correspondent. So really, I was terribly lucky. He was always there. We married in 1951, 42 years. I doubt it. I think that we tend to be much more practical, because in addition to doing the job as Prime Minister, there's usually a house to run, a lot of decisions to be made, and therefore you come to make the practical decisions quickly, keep everything tidy, and keep everything within a pretty tight timetable. And I noticed exactly the same things with Mrs. Gandy, and she would get up and do quite a lot of things herself. She would get up and fetch and carry things and so on. And if she wanted something, she would go and get it. She also, I think, was very lonely. She hadn't a husband. She had 2 sons, and one was killed, as you know, in an air accident. And then her other son, who hadn't been so interested in politics, really had the mantle of politics falling upon him. Mrs. Gandy, as you know, was assassinated one terrible morning. I'd had a letter from her 3 weeks before. It was 3 weeks before her assassination. There'd been an attempt on me with the Brighton bomb, and not only on me, but on my cabinet too. And she wrote such a charming letter saying it's absolutely terrible that these things should happen in democracy. And 3 weeks later, she herself had been assassinated. And then, of course, Rajiv came to be Prime Minister, and I knew him well. And he was assassinated in an election campaign. So I just feel a special bond with that family. They did wonderful things for India. And Mrs. Gandy really cared about every single thing she did. She was such a charming woman, as well as being a very effective Prime Minister. What happened was that Thursday night, I'm always up very late because my main speech, the end of the conference, the big rally speech, is on the Friday. You can't turn up with a speech that has been carefully drafted before you arrive, although some sections will have been drafted, but the thing changes, the atmosphere changes. Some of the issues perhaps take a different turn. And you always have a very long evening on the Thursday. First, you've had to go out to a special ball for the funds for the agents who look after political affairs in the constituency, and you get back about 11:30. And then do the final run on the speech. It was particularly difficult, that year. And it was about 2:45 when I had finished. And 1 or 2 people who'd been helping were just dispersing from my room. And my civil service secretary came in and said, I'm sorry to bother you, but it's a decision I simply must have by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And therefore I think you must look at these papers now. I looked at them very quickly, I knew what it was about, and gave him the decision he needed. That was 2:45. At 10 minutes to 3, the bomb went off, just as he was leaving and taking it back to his room. I thought at first that it was a bomb in a car outside. Dennis had already gone to bed, and I dashed into the bedroom, he was already up. What had happened was, it wasn't a car bomb outside, it was a bomb in a bathroom directly above our suite, 3 or 4 floors above, which in fact had taken out a whole section of the hotel above us, which had gone right up into the air. And the second apparent bomb was as the whole thing collapsed and came down with enormous thuds on top of the existing building. Fortunately, the lights in my suite stayed on, although the windows came in, and 1 or 2 other things happened. I went across the corridor where my girls had been doing the finished typing on my speech to see that they were all right. One had got a shock from one of the electric typewriters. The other one said, I've got the speech, Mrs. Thatcher. It's all right, I've still got the speech. I'm just typing it. Instant reaction, you know, the thing that matters is tomorrow's speech. Marvellous, wasn't it? Gradually, the people who had been in my room earlier came down again to my room, and we began to find some people missing. We were told to stay where we were by my detectives, and then told that we could try to find a way out. And we tried one way, and very soon came across some firemen and a staircase that just had gone, and we couldn't get out that way. And told to go back where we'd come from, which we did again, waited. And then we were told we could try another way, and we did, which took us out through the main hall. And then for the first time, we saw the enormity of the damage. The whole of the front part of the hall was filled with rubble, just where the main entrance was. And we were naturally worried then, immediately, as to whether we had lost some lives. And we began to look for people whom we knew, and hoping that they would have already got out of the building and gone to the police station. The air was full of cement dust. You know, you could taste it in your teeth and everything else. And it just as a kind of fog hung on the air. And I was still in evening dress, I hadn't changed. Dennis had put a suit quickly over his pajamas, and we were driven at breakneck speed from the back of the hotel to the police station, and gradually people began to assemble there. And then we saw some that were missing. And I went out to say something to television and to inquire whether we could still carry on the conference the next morning. And we didn't know then whether the main conference section had been affected or not. By about 5 o'clock, they were urging me to get back to London, thinking it'd be better if I were out of the place. And I said, no, I am staying. I want to carry on next morning, if we can. We went over to a police college which had had a conference there, which fortunately had ended, so there were several rooms where we could just have about an hour and a half sleep. And then I got up. We hadn't any night clothes or anything. And as I got up the next morning, someone had turned on the television, and we saw Norman Tebbit being lifted out of the rubble. And then we knew how many people there were missing. And of course there were 5 people killed and many severely injured. Margaret Thatcher, Norman's wife, is still paralyzed to this day. I found the police and said, was there any hope of starting the conference? He said, yes, the conference hall was all right. And I said, we must go in immediately back to Brighton. We were about 7 or 8 miles out, back to Brighton, because I simply must walk on that platform at 9:30, which is the time the conference starts. In the hotel next door, that had also been cleared because they thought there might be another bomb there. And people had been in their night clothes. I was lucky. I was still in day clothes or evening clothes. And I had seized a suit before we left the hotel. And so Alistair McAlpine was our very able treasurer, had a very bright idea. At 7 o'clock, he rang up the local manager of Marks and Spencer's, one of our famous chain stores, which you know, and said, look, you know what's happened. People haven't really got any respectable clothes to go into to the conference. Could you open up the store? So all the officials and the voluntary side of the party went and all turned up on the platform, beautifully turned out in Marks and Spencer's outfits. And I walked on the platform from one side at 9:30 and they from the other. And at 9:30, the conference restarted. Everyone determined we weren't going to be put off by terrorist bombs. Democracy would prevail. We knew that we had a lot of people missing. We didn't know there'd be other bombs coming in the hall or anyone else. We knew there were a lot of people missing. That's why we prayed, what else can one do under those circumstances? Crawford has been with me for a very long time. She's more than a personal assistant. She's just so indispensable. She also works for Lord Wolfson, because Lord Wolfson came to work for me when I was at Downing Street. And then Crawford works also for me and for him, but she's really a great friend of the family. She knows exactly what to do under almost all circumstances. She's always cheerful. She can always encourage. She can always keep a due sense of proportion. She's always welcome wherever in the world she goes. Chequers is the name of the Prime Minister's country house. It was given to the nation by a gentleman called Lord Lee, who had an American wife, and they had this beautiful home. He was in the cabinet of the World War I cabinet. And when Lloyd George was made our Prime Minister during World War I, Lord and Lady Lee realized that it was a different kind of Prime Minister. For the first time, there was a Prime Minister without a country home. And they thought a Prime Minister should have a country home. They had no children, so they actually refurnished the house with nice antiques. There were some beautiful things there, but they had extra things moved in and nice pictures. Then they themselves moved out and gave it to the nation as a place of rest and recreation for Prime Ministers forever. It's a lovely country house in beautiful grounds, and you do a lot of entertaining of other statesmen there. George and Barbara Bush stayed one weekend with us. And it tends to be sought after by other prime ministers and chancellors. They like to come to Chequers. And it was there, of course, that I first brought Mr. Gorbachev and Reza Gorbachev to meet them, because it's the atmosphere of a country house in winter, big log fires, and just lovely. And about an hour and a quarter driving time. No, my husband was up in the library with her while I was talking to Mr. Gorbachev. But you know, she's a great philosopher. She read philosophy. And I think Dennis took her around and showed her the treasures of the library, and some she was very interested in. Perhaps we attach particular significance to Hobbes' Leviathan. It did seem that at that time that she was a very, very hardline communist, and more so than Mr. Gorbachev. As I wrote in the book, it was much later that I learned that she had reason not to be a hardline communist, because her grandfather was a farmer, what is known as a kulak. They were farmers, quite big farmers, not enormous farmers, not landed estates, but they'd bought other farms and were farming very well. And he had quite a good-sized farm, and Stalin came as he went, his officials went to all other people with land to dispossess them of it at gunpoint. And Mrs. Gorbachev's grandfather refused. He said, no, I have a wife and 4 children. I employ many people on this farm. We farm this farm well, and I'm going to continue to do that. And in accordance with Stalin's communism, he was therefore shot. So Mrs. Gorbachev's mother was one of the 4 children. So she knew the awfulness of communism. Mrs. Gorbachev understood some English. Mr. Gorbachev didn't, but then I didn't speak Russian, so we spoke through interpreters. I think you're more relaxed. You're at home, and you're in a country house, and you welcome guests to the country house. And there's just something very special about that. It's much less formal than 10 Downing Street, just in the same way as Camp David, which is a different kind of country house, is much less formal than the White House. And I've been to Camp David many times. Camp David is several log cabins, but they're rather beautiful log cabins, whereas Chequers is a traditional country house built in Tudor times in the 17th century. No, we were at what was called a very big log cabin hotel, Montebello, not far from Ottawa. It was lovely. They had done everything possible to make it very nice for us, and it was. But I think that when you're going to a summit of heads of state and government, your own people expect you to be formally dressed. And so although we were asked to be informal, I much myself preferred to be wearing a suit just as I would normally. Ronald Reagan knew exactly the broad general direction in which he wished to go, so did I. But I had to do things in much more detail. First, because I was concerned to see that policies stood up, not only in the general terms, but would stand up in the particular detail. They can often fail in the detail. So I often did a lot of cross-examination of other ministers about that. Second, unlike the President of the United States, I was answering questions in the House of Commons twice a week, and I would be asked about detail, so I had to know it. The President of Congress doesn't go down to be asked questions, not in full open session. He goes down to address the House. He doesn't then have a leader of the opposition getting up and criticizing or anything like that. So it's a very different system. And it was necessary that I knew much more detail in order to carry on the job. There is a telephone, and also, if you want a document over in detail, there is a written hotline. No, I don't think these things are to be used very often, but I sometimes received a very welcome call at difficult times from Ronald Reagan, who was very, very thoughtful. No, I don't think so. There were times when, as in Falklands, he wanted me to do something, and I said, certainly not. But there was never any tension between us. We were working for the same purposes and for the same ends, and often by the same methods. And that's just a great thing to know, that the greatest nation in the world has the same view of the philosophy of life, the philosophy of liberty, of justice, and of democracy as you do. Because that was the one which made the Russians understand that they could never keep up with the technology of the United States. They just hadn't the computer capability, and they knew full well that we then were going into a level of technology which they couldn't emulate. So there's no point in them trying to pursue their ends by being the strongest and by threatening others with their powers. That was the end of that particular dream. 1989, the wall came down. I don't think that one actually had the sense that it would come down until you saw those remarkable people crumbling it down with their hands and hammers. It was just fantastic. You know, in most kind of revolutions, it is all of a sudden there's a wave of something and the people do it. And there's nothing that can stop that flood or that tide of feeling. It was just fantastic. I had been to see the wall some years before and was really rather horrified, totally horrified. You got up and looked across and there were dogs patrolling the interim part. And you went to see the river where many people tried to swim across to safety and some were shot. It was everything that one has come to associate with a tyranny maintained by force which had no respect for human life, dignity, or liberty. And that wall was full of drawings, marks, messages, and everything. And when it was actually clawed down, it was just marvelous. We really, one felt, ought to have stopped it from going up in the early 60s when it did. But it wasn't done. But it was the people who brought it down, and that's the wonderful thing about it. That depends how we approach it. after every war, and this was a Cold War, which sometimes was hot, as you know, in Korea and in Vietnam, but the final battles were cold. They weren't open military battles. But after every war, whether it's a hot war or a cold war, there tends to be a euphoria. We've learned the lesson, it must never happen again, therefore it will never happen again. And we let down our guard, and we tend to disarm. But tyrants and dictators have been born throughout the ages. They're not going to stop being born now, and they're not going to stop trying to get power for themselves and their own sake. Since the end of the Cold War, for example, Milosevic in Serbia has invaded Bosnia and has not been stopped. There's a euphoria after the end which makes you say, let's disarm. After World War I, we disarmed too quickly. The Americans left Europe. Had they stayed in Europe, there would never have been World War II. We mustn't make that mistake this time. There's already a war in Bosnia. The Gulf War came after the end of the Cold War. On the other hand, the end of the Cold War has facilitated some peace processes like the one in the Middle East between the Palestinian people and the Jewish people. But in the whole of my life in politics, the unexpected happened. Whether it was the invasion of the Falklands, whether it was the invasion of Kuwait, whether it was the Libyan raid we suddenly had to do. Thank goodness we'd had the wise foresight to see that we had all the right weaponry, whether it was in the Navy, in the Army, or the Air Force. The right aircraft, the right ships, the right missiles, the right and latest technology. It's that which helped to bring the Cold War to an end without a shot being fired. That and SDI. So we must not go into a euphoric phase now. At the end of the collapse of great empires, new dangers arise. There are 15 countries that form the former Soviet Union. There are civil wars in some of them, as in Georgia, as in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, Azerbaijan. We must not let our defenses go down too far. There'll be new threats, and we must know that whatever your Prime Minister or President decides to do, the requisite weaponry is there to do it. Otherwise, we shall once again be in retreat and find it difficult to recover the full liberties and democracy that we have known. Do you know, now I've been out of power for nearly 3 years. I think I'm treated the same way in both. I'm almost hailed as a heroine, as people look back and see what we did, how purposeful and exciting it was. And a fantastic number of young people come to buy the book. They didn't always like what I did, but they knew that it had purpose and direction. And I found it as I went round in a tour of the United Kingdom. Of course, there are some people who are against one. The Socialist Workers' Party will demonstrate against you. But by and large, the appreciation is enormous. And I think the thing they say to me most often in Britain is, thank you for what you did for our country. And that matters to me a great deal. Both of them could marshal words as if they were soldiers. Both had great flights of oratory. But both had a sense of purpose and direction, and they never faltered. That is the similarity. I believe there's a message in that book. There's a message that if you chart your course and know the compass of values which will lead you through the future, then you will get through. You will be true to the very best of your country. You'll be true to the challenges and this strenuous life of liberty, to its responsibilities, to justice, and to democracy. And it's all so positive. It's not just let things alone. It is, liberty is a marvelous thing, particularly if you've not had it and people haven't known it. But it's not just sitting back, it's using your God-given talents. It's having a sense of responsibility for your own family, a sense of obligation to your neighbor. And in the end, what you're trying to do in government is to have a framework of law and a background which encourages all that is best in people and which is tough on all that is evil and worse. and that is for the sake of a better future. When are you coming back? No, life doesn't happen like that. You don't go back. Not after you've been in 11.5 years. Winston did, because he'd never won an election, and it must have been terrible for him when, having won the war, he was rejected. But he came back in another election and was gladly accepted and embraced by the people again. I've been there for 3 elections. I've never lost an election. And if John Major decides eventually to leave office, there'll be many others who want to be Prime Minister. And just as I was young and had the chance, so they must have their chance. Yes, he was English, but he came and had a career in America. Gordon was not only, he'd worked in television. He did advise one on television and stopped one from making quite a lot of mistakes. But Gordon had something else. When things were very bad, Gordon came in and looked on the bright side, and he was always optimistic. On a television program with my opposite number, no. I will tell you why. I believed passionately what I was doing. I wasn't going to put the whole thing in issue. And so I said to the interviewer, no, you're not going to judge the whole of my record and the whole of my future on how people perform in a particular debate. And if you want to know, you just ask me for an interview. I will give you an interview for 2 hours, or if you like, for 4 hours continuously. You can ask anything and everything. Do the same to my political opponent. That's when you'll soon find that the electorate will sort out who can do it and who can't. I don't think they'll need to. You see, in our case, I was debating twice a week in the House of Commons with question time, so people knew precisely I could stand up to the leader of the opposition, because it was true. I often found them much more vain than we were. I think I was very practical, and so were my women colleagues. It wasn't things that mattered for my reputation, it was what I could do which mattered to our country. So I thought that although they attribute women, they say to women, you're vain, I don't think we were. I think we were much less vain. And they often attribute to women the incapability of making tough decisions. It was they, I found, who weren't able to make the tough decisions, and often they couldn't bear it when I made it. It was artificial. Each of them wanted their own say, each of them wanted to make their own mark, and I felt that there was the atmosphere of a sort of verbal minuet about it, you know. You didn't get to grips with the issues, because I go very directly to the issues. And in the way in which Ron Reagan and I usually could get to grips with them. Quite often, particularly if I wanted to get something really thrashed out, quite often it would have been with President Mitterrand or often with Ronald Reagan. I don't think so quite so often with Chancellor Kohl. No, but he understood some. His lady wife was a very fluent English speaker. Depends very much on the interpreter. Now, one that I had, Richard Pollock, who used to come with me on all tours to Russia, he would listen very carefully, not only to what I was saying, but to the intonation of my voice. And so he would follow in his interpretation the precise intonation which I had used. That was marvelous. And so Mr. Gorbachev would get not only the meaning of the words, but the emphasis which I placed upon them. Otherwise, if they just do what I call a deadpan interpretation, you miss the emphasis, you miss the real importance of what your Russian counterpart is saying. I started it about a fortnight before Christmas. Not last Christmas, the Christmas before. Yes, I did. I needed a historian. I needed an archivist. I had to look up a great number of the papers myself. I had to dictate a great many of my impressions. And also, I had quite a number of papers myself, and I wrote a lot down. First, you've got to get it all, you've got to get a lot down. Once you've got it down and in the right order, you go on refining and refining and refining. Then you've got to get a next lot down. So in the end, you've got about 3 lots. The one you've done the latest bit, the second one that you're revising, and the third one that you're going back doing a final revise. So it's quite exhausting and exacting. No, I think we've got most of the main things in. There are several detailed things that I haven't got in, but most of the main things are in. The second book is going to be about my early life, how I came to have the views that I held, and how I first became interested in politics, and my early political days. I was in Parliament from 1959. That book starts from 1979, so there's quite a big story to tell there. Yes, there was Keith Joseph, who was a colleague of mine, a parliamentary colleague, and he was very, very active in redrawing up the whole philosophy of the Conservative Party after we'd lost 3 elections under Ted. Very active indeed. And if Keith had decided to stand for the leadership, I should have loyally supported him and not have stood myself. As it was, Keith came to me one day and said, "Look, I really don't think I can stand. I couldn't take some of the things that are said about a leader. So I'm just going to be an ordinary backbench member of Parliament," which he proceeded to be. And I said, "Keith, if you're not going to stand, I'm going to. Someone who holds our political view, someone who wants to go in the direction we want to go, has got to stand against the incumbent leader of the party that was Ted Heath." And that's how I came to stand. If I wanted a seminar on a particular subject, for example, perhaps the most interesting one was, I wanted after 1983 to have a seminar on what we could possibly do to make have much more contact with the Soviet Union, and also much more contact with countries like Poland and Hungary. And we worked out a plan of action, which was to try to look for people, younger people in the Soviet Union, who would be a bit fed up with communism because it wasn't working. And we found Mr. Gorbachev. And that was absolutely fascinating. Then I also visited Hungary because I wanted to get to know some of the younger people again who were running businesses in that country. Yes, I couldn't stand just the reading from the briefs at all. You can always tell it. You can always tell when they have their own particular views. And often they would come to a meeting, open their folders, and so often the civil servants' view is really rather different from the politicians. And that shows how the minister deals with it. The good one is one who won't read from his brief, but who will give you his own view. He might then say, "But I'm advised to do differently." That was on the evening of the day after, the evening of the day I had returned from Paris. I had a series of meetings. It was after the first ballot. And although we got a majority of the party, it was not a big enough majority, by 2 votes only. And they'd all lost their nerve. I'd been away in Paris and didn't come back until the next day. What was I doing in Paris? I was signing some of the disarmament agreements we'd reached with Russia. There were 34 heads of state and government there. And I got back and this thing had fallen apart. I realized we must have a much more active campaign. And then I decided that I would see each and every one of my members of cabinet alone, in succession. And so I called them in. And the results you'll see in the book. It was all just so artificial and so hurtful. There were 1 or 2 who were distraught that others had lost their nerve, but mostly, even from my very great friends, with 1 or 2 exceptions, it ran like this. "Now look, you know that I'm a friend of yours, but I feel it's my duty to tell you as a friend that although I'll support you if you stand again for a second ballot, I don't think you can win. And therefore, I think it would be better if you stood down and let someone else in the cabinet stand against the Michael Heseltine, who was also running at that time." And one after another this happened. And I don't think they knew the effect on me, because they clearly had a kind of caucus meeting and decided what they were going to say. And I knew that I could win if I could get all cabinet going out there and saying, "Look, we must get a couple more, 3 or 4 more votes for Margaret." You can win if you go out all guns blazing, but my guns wouldn't blaze. And I just rocked backwards and thought, well, this weak lot, I really don't think I can carry on with them. I didn't think at that time what I was going to do, but I had been in the House of Commons for 33 years. 31 out of those 3 years, I'd been on the front bench. That is to say, I'd either been in government when we were in power, or when we were in opposition, I'd been a lead member in the opposition team, and therefore always in a lead position to criticise existing government. So in other words, I'd always been what we call on the front bench, a full minister, or shadowing a minister, marking a minister. And afterwards, after I resigned, and after I'd had that famous debate in the House, which was very exciting, the last one I did from the front bench, I then had to go back into the House for the first time for 31 years, walk onto the back benches. I didn't like it. It wasn't for me. Because when I got up to make a contribution from the back bench as an ordinary member of Parliament, everyone would murmur and there'd be a roar as I got up. It was a highly charged and artificial atmosphere. And I found it difficult, not for a time, not to make the decisions. I'd been used to making decisions, and it took me a time to get into the understanding that I was not making the decisions, and I could influence them, but I couldn't make them. And so I didn't want to carry on in the House of Commons. And then people said, well, you must stay on because you can come back. I said, no, life doesn't happen that way. I've been here 11.5 years. I had to go sometime. I think the Prime Minister will find it easier if I'm not in the House of Commons and in a position to return. So I will accept the offer to go up to the House of Lords, but it's so much more gentlemanly, and you don't get the quick flash of the quick wit and the give and take of debate which you get in the House of Commons. Just exactly what one says. I think when many people come to look at our House of Commons, they come with the idea of a very dignified body, does things very dignified way, and certainly we wouldn't throw things and certainly wouldn't get up and fight, but the verbal attacks are very considerable. It's very, very fast-moving debate. You're often interrupted, and you've got to have a ready reply to anyone who challenges you. I most earnestly hope so. We're the two nations that have more in common than any other two. The Pilgrim Fathers went with the whole background of English and the biblical ethics. They knew and took with them our system of justice, a very famous one. When Jefferson came to write that remarkable Constitution, which is the best expression in the English language, the best expression of liberty, he wrote like a genius, which I suppose he was. And it was quite clear from that Constitution that it's the first Constitution in the world, and possibly still the only one, that it is the people who give the powers to the government for a limited time to govern them, not the government giving powers to the people. It's very different. What I had was regular meetings in the House of Commons and regularly taking part in the debates in the House of Commons and in question time. What I also had was I was Prime Minister because I had a majority in the House of Commons. So we had a good chance of getting through any legislation we put up, and we had a good chance of getting the budget through, because I wouldn't have been there without a majority. So we don't have the conflict of interest that sometimes arises with your president when he can't get a measure through the House. Very, very different atmosphere completely. I think so. I think that automatically everything here is considered. What's the presentation going to be? Almost before you've considered the other aspect of it. I regarded my job as to get the policies right. When we got the policies right, we would think about the presentation, but not the other way around. Yes. Because you can listen to a speech, and sometimes you'll say, that's a rhetoric speech. It's just talking, there's nothing really well known underneath it. The person hasn't got to the heart of the matter. Or you can listen to a speech which might be a bit duller, but a person has really got to rock bottom solid and knows the heart of the matter and is trying to deal with it. They're very different kinds of oratory. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.